everyone, and welcome to the 5th edition of Energy 101. If you're not already muted, if you could go ahead and mute yourself, that'll just improve the sound quality for everyone. My name is Kate Salamito, and I'm the Experiential Learning Coordinator at the Irving Institute. And I'm excited to welcome tonight Rosi Kerr, who's the Director of Sustainability at Dartmouth. And she's here today to talk about electricity, the electric grid specifically in the US, and how it connects all of us to one another, whether we know it or not. Rosie, would you like to introduce yourself and kick things off?
Sure. As Kate said, I'm Rosi Kerr, and I'm the Director of Sustainability at the college. I came to sustainability to some extent through the energy sector, the electricity sector specifically. I went to Dartmouth as an undergraduate, and then I did a little of a lot of things. And then I went to graduate school at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, now the Yale School of the Environment, to originally to understand how environmental education could move us towards greater action on climate change. But like many graduate students, the arc of my trajectory kind of changed as I went through graduate school and did my graduate research, which was in a small community in rural Alaska, where I became really interested in energy issues, principally because when I asked people what the biggest issues were in their small community, they specifically said, well, electricity is very, very expensive here. Many small rural communities, including the one I was in Alaska, are not connected to the grid. They're off grid and they run on generators, essentially, giant generators, small electricity generation facilities. And so I began investigating the energy industry in Alaska and ended up working on a project to change waste from salmon processing plants into biodiesel that could be used for small scale generation. And that led me into the energy sector sort of unwittingly. And I probably started off with my approach was a lot about environmental justice and rural communities and long-term resiliency and sustainability of those communities. So that's kind of the attitude I arrived in the energy sector with. I went to work after graduate school in the energy industry, electricity and natural gas specifically in New York City, where I was working for a startup electricity and natural gas supplier, but I was focused on pitching renewables as a way to help large-scale commercial and industrial clients hedge their electricity prices. So because the electricity cost of renewables behaves slightly differently than the electricity cost of fossil fuel-based generation, the argument was you could use electricity generated from renewables as a way to manage the cost and risk of part of your electricity portfolio. If you're something like a paper manufacturer, electricity could potentially be 80% of your operating cost. So fluctuations in the market that might seem minor to a residential consumer like me would feel very significant to someone who's working in an industry like paper, where a huge part of their operating cost is the input of electricity. So that was very interesting for me. I learned a lot, traveled all over New York State, and learned a lot about, the paper industry, the sugar industry, any industry you can think of that uses an enormous amount of electricity, sort of got to know the back end of. And I got to learn a lot about electricity markets, the financial side of electricity markets, which was fascinating to me. And then after that, I went to work for a startup that did demand side energy management. So they helped large scale commercial and industrial clients, particularly colleges and universities, manage the exposure they have to the electricity markets by improving their energy efficiency and reducing their exposure in that way. So that was another interesting learning experience. There I was mostly working in the Massachusetts electricity market, which is very different than New York. And then I came from there to Dartmouth 10 years ago to lead the sustainability office. And a lot of my focus at Dartmouth on the operational side has been understanding and trying to transform Dartmouth's energy landscape and help Dartmouth manage cost and risk while improving sustainability. So it's kind of a little bit about my exposure to the energy market. There's probably folks on this call who know as much or more as I do, and some of my knowledge is quite out of date in terms of the electricity market. So if there are folks, typically there are in in Irving programs who know a lot about the energy sector. I'm happy to have you speak up, ask questions, join however you want. Maybe I'll like take a pause there and just see if there's any questions or maybe particular things that you'd like to talk about tonight that you're curious about. We've sort of billed this as electricity, covering electricity. But I'd love to know if people have particular concerns, questions, things they're curious about, or maybe this is a topic you don't know anything about, so you don't know what to ask.
Feel free to unmute yourself and ask those questions or put them in the chat, whatever you're most comfortable with or technologically able to do.
Hi, this is Harry Higgs. Yeah, I wanted to ask, I've been learning about and intrigued by these initiatives in New Hampshire, the Clean Energy New Hampshire, and initiatives to change the electricity market here. I mean, what do you think about that, and are you involved in that?
I am not directly involved in that at all. I actually am a resident of Vermont. So I'm probably a little bit more involved on the Vermont side of the border, which is an interesting thing to think about, is that Vermont, New Hampshire, here are these states that in some ways are similar, have incredibly different electricity markets and electricity landscapes and energy landscapes for a variety of very interesting and informative policy reasons, as well as, the politics of the states are quite different. But in general, I think that there are some, in general, although renewable electricity is increasingly becoming part of electricity markets because it is cost effective, in general, there are really important roles for policy to influence how electricity markets are transformed or are not transformed. An interesting example of that is that in New Hampshire, there is a very low, what's called a net metering cap, which is a policy decision, which means that if you want to build a solar farm in New Hampshire, there's a cap on how big that solar farm can be and still have you be able to dump power into the grid, which effectively means that you're really limited. Dartmouth, for example, is really limited in terms of how big a renewable array we can build because of the net metering cap in New Hampshire. So that's an example of a public policy that has a huge effect on how Dartmouth is going to move forward on renewable energy. Whereas in Vermont, the net metering cap is much higher. So you can build a large scale solar array. Whether you think that's good or bad, that's the reality. I see Marjorie's on the call, and she probably knows a lot more about Clean Power New Hampshire than I do. So I'm happy, Marjorie, if you want to talk about that, feel free to pipe up. And she also included the link in the chat to Clean Energy New Hampshire for anyone who's curious. I see a question around how are renewables integrated into the existing grid, which is really built around large power generation stations, and how much can the current grid flex to accommodate increasing electrification of transportation, et cetera. This is a huge challenge. Again, not an area where I'm an expert, but a really significant challenge. The grid is actually a name we use to describe a whole series of loosely connected electricity grids. Some of them are very, very outdated. Some of them are less outdated. I think that the aging infrastructure of the grid is going to be a significant hurdle that we're going to have to get over in the next 30 years. See California. See, the book that Howard Schaefer mentioned in the chat, Shorting the Grid, How the Grid Became Fragile. Potentially that's like another little window into some of the challenges that we'll face just in the grid delivering power to growing demand, let alone the grid incorporating renewables. However, there are lots of ways in which renewables can make the grid more resilient. And I think, again, the policy comparison between New Hampshire and Vermont is illuminative. Illuminative, is that a word?
Illuminative.
Illuminative or illuminating. Both maybe witty electricity puns. In terms of helping us see how we can focus on grid resiliency while adding renewables. But I think that the current grid flex is a big stumbling block for adding renewables and for the electrification of transportation. And Ebbs and flows from solar is another question, let alone wind and power. Again, I think this is a huge issue. So renewables are intermittent power sources. Adding them to a grid that was designed for continuous power sources is a really big challenge. I think maybe I will switch to my slides if that's okay, Kate, or
Yeah, I was actually just about to cut in and say that these questions are all really great and are great segues for the actual conversation that we were hoping to have tonight. So I think this is a really great moment to switch into what you'd prepared.
Okay, and we can circle back around to these questions, and or if people don't feel that they've been answered, please do feel free to chime up with, you still haven't answered my question.
And Rosie, just as you're preparing your slides, another thing for folks to know is that as in the past several sessions, we do have time set aside for people that ask questions as we go along. So you'll see slides that say any questions, ? And that'll be a good time also to hop in and ask about anything you're unsure about that we've spoken about in the last few minutes.
I also might just stop and say any questions with my voice. So we'll do that too. So we're going to look a little bit at how the electricity grid works. And how electricity markets work and what that actually means in the world. One topic that I have included in this talk before and that I'm happy to go into tonight, or that I'm happy to leave, is the topic of pipelines, which is kind of related. It's related because our electricity grid right now is increasingly being powered by natural gas. It's also related because both of these things are infrastructure networks that we generally don't really think about, but they run, they power our country. And they have a huge impact. How they're designed and built has a huge impact in how our country functions. So we can talk about those things as time allows and as people's interest allows. So you guys have seen this Gantt chart, I think, in every Energy 101 that you have so far attended. Tonight, we're going to be talking about this portion of the energy sector, that is the electricity sector. So if you think about all of our source fuels over here on the left-hand side, and then this Gantt chart shows those source fuels flowing through the United States economy. And some of those source fuels are used to create electricity. 37% of them are used to create electricity, or of the MMBTUs in those source fuels. That's the component that we're talking about tonight. One of my favorite things about this Gantt chart, by the way, that I talk about a lot with those of you who are students on the call, you might have heard me say this, but I see this Gantt chart as indicative of the enormous opportunity in the energy sector, something that we're not going to talk about as much, but that I'm very passionate about, and that there's lots of opportunity around in the electricity industry, is this rejected energy, ghost gray part of the Gantt chart. Rejected energy, that's another term for wasted energy. And to me, that's really compelling. That means that 67.5, this number here, 67.5% of the energy that is available in the source fuels located on the left side of the Gantt chart is rejected or lost somewhere as it moves through the US economy. Some of that energy is very difficult to recover. There are inefficiencies that are hard to capture energy from, but a lot of those inefficiencies are very, very easy to capture energy from. So to me, when I'm talking to students, this is a huge opportunity in the US economy to improve our efficiency. This is a sign that probably these source fuels are not expensive enough. We're not used to thinking about energy as expensive enough in real terms, and we waste an enormous amount of it. It also means there's plenty of jobs to be had making money, saving people energy, which is something I encourage students to think about on a regular basis. So I want to talk a little bit about what we're talking about when we talk about electricity arriving in your house. Probably most of you are well aware of this, but I think one of the interesting things about energy in general, and electricity certainly falls into this category, and this is certainly particularly true for students, the students I work with at Dartmouth, who do not yet, generally speaking, pay their own electricity bill. This system provides these vital services, but we think about it very, very little. So most electricity in the United States is generated somewhere at a central power plant. As someone pointed out in the comments, that's typically a large scale power plant. It in the United States right now is probably burning natural gas, or is nuclear, is large scale hydro, or is coal, a decreasing percentage of coal. And one of those things is being burned and power is being dumped into the grid. Some of it is also being generated by wind turbines and solar, but still on a national scale, that's a small slice of the pie. If we include hydro, I think we're talking about 14% or so of total electricity generation coming from renewables. So that power plant generates electricity. Electricity flows from the power plant through a transformer, goes into transmission lines, is stepped down again from high voltage transmission into distribution lines. And then it comes to your house, either in a buried line or on a pole, and enters your house through an electricity meter. That's how electricity works for most residential situations, for most homes. It's also how power works for a place like Dartmouth. At Dartmouth, obviously, we consume a lot of power, 65,000 megawatt hours a year of power. So that's about 7,000 homes worth of power. But we still receive it in the same way. Most of our power is received in the same way. We have 3 substations on campus from which we receive power. So sorry, I'm not very good at the share screen click. So there's also the information flow regarding energy. And when I was working in the electricity sector, this is one of the things that I found most interesting to learn about. If you think about the electricity system, it's not much like Dartmouth's infrastructure, for example. It did not get built in a day. It evolved over time. So, at first there were very few electrified buildings, and slowly we expanded our capacity. Slowly we added generation. Slowly we added electricity lines. And several things were interesting about that. One is that we had to, we regulated electricity, right? When we started electrifying the United States. And we did that because without regulation, it was clear just with market forces that electricity, that only people who could afford it would receive electricity, and electrification would be very spotty, which is what started to happen, right? So then we as a nation, we regulated electricity so that electricity would be distributed to everybody, regardless of people's ability to pay. Right? In terms of the transmission infrastructure and the distribution infrastructure. So a power line would never get built to that farm out in the end of the road in Iowa if it wasn't regulated, because that one consumer wouldn't be enough for the market forces to drive power down that road, right? So more recently, we deregulated electricity at least partly to restore competition, which I'll talk about a little further along. But if you think about this thing that kind of evolved, this grid, this system of wires, literally, that's delivering electricity, and it evolved in a haphazard way with some infrastructure added in 1940 and some in 1950 and some in 1960, et cetera, to today. What you have is this, this patchwork of equipment. You also have consumers at the end of it, at one end of it, and generation at the other end of it. And you need because electricity can't be stored meaningfully, right? Like we store electricity in batteries, which I happen to have one right here, right? But you can't, there's no battery, there's no like giant batteries sitting around yet. That's changing, but that's not yet a thing. It's still way too expensive to store electricity in batteries. There are some ways we store electricity, for example, by transitioning electrical energy to mechanical energy and back to electrical energy, by using electricity to pump water into storage dams and then allowing water to flow through hydroelectric dams to provide power. But we have very poor energy storage. For that reason, we have to have the ability to regulate the amount of energy that's in the system at any given time. I find this fascinating because it means that we need to know the generation units need to know how much power is Alex and Harry and Kate and the Irving Institute and Dartmouth and Acme Manufacturing Incorporated going to use tomorrow, so that we can have the right amount of fuel to generate that amount of power so that we can meet the demand instantaneously. Because if we don't meet the demand instantaneously, the grid will experience brownouts and blackouts if there's too much demand. And We can't store it. So if we generate too much, we'll waste it, right? So there's this constant balancing act. This map is a map of all the grids and their ISOs, their independent systems operators. And those are the sort of traffic cops that regulate the flow of information and electricity in the grid around the United States. As I said, these grids are loosely connected, but not well connected. So I can't flow power from New England to Florida because of the interconnections. There are places like New York City down here where there are congestion problems, sort of like congestion, heart congestion, where there are only so many power lines running into New York City, and you can only flow so much power at any given time. And you might have tons of demand in New York City and have an inability to meet it because you can't physically flow enough power into New York City. And you can't just like take power from Florida and like dump it into New York because those grids aren't connected in a meaningful way. So hopefully that gives you, just gonna double check the chat here and see if I have any questions that have popped up.
Rosie, maybe before you do that, could you
Yeah.
talk for a minute just about like functionally on a minute by minute basis, what is like the PJM interconnection or the New York ISO or ISO New England? Like, what does it look like in that control room? What do they do?
Yeah. So that's a great segue. So ISOs, oops, gosh darn it, I just touched something and it changes. Marjorie asked, what's the lilac color versus the light green indicate on the map? So these are just, I think these are just regions as I remember. And these regions, so the light green, these have meaningful connections to each other, but they don't have meaningful connections to ERCOT down here or to the Western grid. So there's no like east-west connection that's bringing these two regions together, but PJM, New York and New England do have connection. You can flow power between these things. It's not easy, but it can be done. So that's what those mean. So moving on to what actually happens in the ISOs. So the ISOs, these independent systems operators, they provide three more major functions. They literally operate the grid. So when you pay your power bill, if you paid Liberty Utilities, and your check caught fire on the way, and then it brought sparks into the Liberty building, and you burned down the Liberty building that received your check, your power would stay on. Why would it stay on? Well, the grid operation is actually being monitored and managed by the ISO, which interacts with Liberty but is not the same, right? So they are coordinating and directing the flow of electricity through the grid on the high voltage transmission system. So the connections between interconnected grids, as well as how much power is in the grid at any given time. They also oversee the markets for electricity. So they are actually responsible for buying and selling electricity to wholesale customers. And then they are also responsible for long-term planning for the grid. So they're responsible for making sure that in 10 years, this thing doesn't shut down because we didn't do a good job to manage New England's needs in 10 years. So that is the role of the ISO. What an ISO physically actually is essentially a command and control station. If you go visit an ISO, it is a office type environment with a giant control room with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of screens and tens and tens and tens of people monitoring those screens to make sure that the grid is operating correctly at any given time. So does that answer your question, Kate? And is that a reason?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it totally does. I guess
you've been to an ISO, so feel free to pipe up.
Yeah, I mean, to give people a physical image of it, and these are really secure facilities. Like if you can imagine, if Rosie was a nefarious actor and she wanted to waltz into ISO New England and, punch a few buttons and insert a USB stick where it doesn't belong and shut down the grid, that would have massive implications. I mean, you're talking about hospitals getting shut down, hospitals have backup generators, but imagine the security risks that are associated with being able to sabotage the grid. So like they have one wall of a room is literally just a giant screen that has like every single generation asset in New England, for instance, showing all the interconnections between the adjacent grids. And there are like 6 control stations, and there are, mostly guys, mostly former naval officers, incidentally, monitoring like on a minute by minute basis the generation versus consumption. And so, they'll pick up a phone and they'll call a natural gas plant in central Massachusetts, and they'll say, hey, in 15 minutes I need you to ramp up your generation to this level for 2 hours and then ramp it down. Or they'll call up a nuclear power plant in New Hampshire and say, I'm going to need you to ramp down at this rate for this long. Or they'll call a peaker plant, which is a plant that only operates during peak demand times, and they'll say, hey, we're having a really high unexpected peak this afternoon and we need you to ramp up rapidly in order to meet demand. Or they'll just all like it's like if you've seen like a movie about like Apollo landings, like the Houston, we have a problem, like that control, like that's what it's like. It's very cool and very dramatic. And if you ever have a chance to visit one, you really should, because it's a great experience.
And Marjorie asked in the chat, is an ISO a private corporation, a government entity, et cetera? ISOs are semi-governmental nonprofit organizations. So they're not running to make a profit, they're running to run the grid. And they're sort of like semi-autonomous, semi-governmental organizations. They're not within the government, but they sort of collaborate closely. Any other questions before I move on? Oh, look, any questions? So maybe moving to how electricity is generated. So Kate mentioned that, the folks at the ISO are kind of calling plants constantly and saying, power up, or power down. What the plants that they're calling are plants that are burning something or somehow capturing mechanical energy like hydro and turning it into electricity by running water through a turbine. And those plants are sort of vital infrastructure in the United States. I think something that that I talk about a lot with students is the extent to which we've become reliant on affordable, accessible energy, both in terms of transportation fuels and also in terms of the electricity that powers our homes. We had a power outage at Dartmouth. When was that, Kate? Like 3 years ago during the summer, and it was the longest power outage Dartmouth had had in a long time. I think it was 7 or 8 hours.
I think it was summer 2015, if I remember.
There was rebellion. There was overwhelming rebellion because students didn't have power. There was no hot food in the dining hall, and I think for many students it was maybe one of the longer power outages they'd experienced, and it was pretty shocking to many students. So I think we've gotten quite accustomed to electricity being available all the time. So electricity in the United States is largely generated. I think people often think that electricity is generated with oil, interestingly, and that is not very true. You can see on this graph that oil is this kind of brownish color to me, light brown. Renewables is the green. Nuclear is the red, natural gas is the blue, and coal is the dark brown. And you can see how these things are changing over time. So I think a couple things are notable about this graph. One is from 1950 to now, how much our electricity consumption has grown. Really enormously. Another is from probably 2000, the part that I find the most interesting is from 2000 until now, how the distribution of our electricity generation has changed. So you can see coal descending, you can see the width of the natural gas band growing, and you can see nuclear sort of stayed the same. Whatever was built in 1990 whatever is what we've got. And then you can see renewables on the rise, and petroleum, et cetera. That's like petroleum and petroleum coke and all these like byproducts, number 6 fuel oil, et cetera. These things are kind of dwindling as electricity, stationary generation, not something we really use anymore. So this is interesting, I think, to think about what renewables are a growing percentage of our renewables portfolio. So you can see that hydroelectric, which is the biggest, I think it's just being eclipsed by wind, but has been for a long time the biggest component of our renewables portfolio, has kind of remained more or less in the same range for a long time. We're not really building a lot of new dams, and that has sort of leveled off. We've added some biomass in the last 50 years. You can see, though, that wind and solar are the rapidly growing portions of this program. A word about why I use the like air quotes for the renewability of hydroelectric. For those of you that are not familiar with the controversies around hydroelectric and its renewability, there's been a longstanding conversation in the world of renewable energy about whether hydroelectric is or should qualify as renewable energy. The reasons for that are several-fold. One is the sort of long-standing reasons are that building large-scale hydroelectric dams is very, very environmentally impactful. Things like the Hoover Dam, et cetera. Even things like the Wilder Dam, radically reshaped the Connecticut River Valley and the Connecticut River itself. So, and I think more recently, there have been concerns about the extent to which hydroelectric and dams actually create anaerobic degradation or anaerobic what would you call that? Decomposition on the subsurface of the river, and that can create methane emissions, which actually can be a potent greenhouse gas. So there are some evolving data around whether dams actually do produce carbon or carbon emissions equivalents in the form of methane emissions and other unintended emissions by creating these backups in river systems. They also inhibit habitats, ecosystems, things like fish, salmon, et cetera. Migratory fish. And so there's a lot of controversy around hydroelectric. Somebody asked, what about ocean and wave energy? Is that growing? That's a sort of interesting and rapidly evolving field. I would consider ocean and wave energy still to be in the experimental phase. There's a lot of work being done on how can we harness tidal energy, wave energy, to produce large scale energy. So it is not yet really on the chart. It's not a significant percentage of our renewables, but there's a lot of research being done. I recently read a paper about the Bay of Fundy and research that's being done there into where there are some of the largest tides in the world. There's a lot of research being done there to try to capture that tidal energy. Apparently, actually, the largest tides in the world are quite difficult to harness. Because of the fluctuations are pretty dramatic, but there is work being done in this area. And I would say we're some years out, but maybe good to start investing in those things now. You heard it here first. I have no major investments or ownership stakes in anything, so don't worry. This is purely me talking. So this is an interesting thing to think about is who's actually consuming electricity. So commercial and industrial consumers of electricity consume more electricity when combined than residential end users, but residential end users actually consume a lot of electricity. So I think it's really interesting to look at, how that breaks down. Commercial is things like office buildings, New York City. Industrial is things like, the Domino sugar plant in Yonkers, or the paper mills that I was referring to, right? Or a factory. That's the difference. So someone asked a question, there's a lot of rooftop solar that gets used but does not get controlled by the ISO. What percentage might this be on a July afternoon? That depends a lot on what ISO you're in. If you're in California, the percentage of rooftop solar is very significant and growing. If you're in Vermont, that's still not a very big percentage. If you're in New Hampshire, that's a very tiny percentage. Even though you drive around and see it on rooftops, it's still a very small percentage of our July electricity consumption. That's particularly true because in most energy systems, not all, but most energy systems, peak electricity consumption is on the hottest hour of the hottest day of the summer. That's when we use the most electricity. So because air conditioning uses a huge amount of electricity, and HVAC systems, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, those heating and ventilation, or ventilation is another important component of that on a hot summer day. So a couple other questions from the chat. One is, what about temperature differential energy opportunities as alternative source, biomass, surface ocean / earth versus deep ocean / earth temp differentials, etc. So I know mostly about this as relates to using ground source heat or ground source cooling as a way to avoid or reduce the amount of electricity that's used for heating and cooling. I don't know very much about differential temperature as an electricity generation source. I'm happy to have Richard Sanford speak up if you do know about that and you'd like to share about that. Maybe I'll just mention a little bit about using the surface versus subsurface temperature as a way to generate energy or to capture energy or to avoid consuming electricity. So we might use the ground as a source for heating or cooling as a way to avoid burning something to provide heating or cooling. So an example of that is using ground source in our region where we don't have very, very warm subsurface temperatures. So for example, if you go to Iceland or Hawaii, Iceland's maybe a better example because they have a cooling, they have a cool winter and a heating requirement similar to ours. You can like stick a pipe in the ground in Iceland and get hot water right out of the ground because Iceland has geothermal properties right under the surface of the earth. Not true here, right? In New Hampshire, where we have granite under the subsurface of the earth. However, it is true that on a cold winter day, the subsurface is, if you go down below 6 feet below the frost line, it is 55 or 58 or something degrees underground year round. So I can run a pipe down into the ground. I can use a pump using electricity to pump water down into that pipe and pull the water back up into my home. And I can use that to bring my home to 58 degrees, right? Which is a lot warmer than -20 or 0 or 12 that it might be outside. So I could preheat or pre-cool my house using that. In the summer, obviously 58 degrees is cooler than the air temperature. And I can use that water that I've sent down into the ground and pumped back up to cool my home. And that's a way that I can use the ground as a thermal battery and a pump using electricity to move the thermal properties of the ground up into my house, for lack of a better way to describe that. And I can reduce the amount of stuff I have to burn by using electricity just to generate to move the pump, right? And maybe I can generate that electricity using solar, for example. So that's a way that I might defray some of the current electricity consumption that I might do to heat or cool, and avoid burning carbon or burning as much carbon to heat or cool my home. Someone also, Bill Brown, asked, why aren't we talking about carbon-free or carbon neutral energy? Leaving nuclear out of the analysis causes us to chase the wrong goal. This is a very interesting topic. Again, one I'm not an expert on, but that I've read a little bit about. I think there's some really interesting work being done in nuclear. It's a very interesting conversation to be had around, is nuclear better or worse than choose your electricity source you want to compare it against, natural gas or renewables or coal. Clearly, nuclear has some risks and some benefits. And what you mean when you say nuclear is really important. Are you talking about, Yankee, Seabrook? Are you talking about stuff we built 30 or 40 or 50, Chernobyl 50 years ago? Or are you talking about where we're headed with nuclear, which is much more efficient, smaller systems that are using spent fuel over and over and over again, and therefore producing very little spent fuel per unit of energy produced? And where you might be producing a waste product that is hazardous to the environment, but you have to weigh that against avoiding producing carbon, and you can generate an enormous amount of electricity using nuclear. So I'm not going to offer an opinion on this, but it's certainly a very, very interesting very interesting topic to have on the table. And especially there was a recent development at MIT regarding fission and small scale nuclear reactors that's fascinating. I've had several people suggest this as a possibility for Dartmouth. I have a very funny time thinking about the zoning board meeting where I have to propose that we're going to put a small scale reactor in Hanover. So I think there's a lot of, there's a lot of public perception challenges around nuclear. It's very difficult to permit for those reasons, et cetera, et cetera. And even if you believe nuclear is our salvation, you still have to navigate those permitting challenges when and if you ever want to build it. So, so I think it's a very, very interesting topic, and maybe I'll leave it there since I'm not an expert, but I'd be happy to defer to Bill or others if they are experts and want to speak on it.
I think, Rosie, just one interesting thing about that is that I think there are many people who have very strong opinions on the issue of nuclear. I remember, I'm hoping I'm remembering the correct attribution of person to quote, but if I remember correctly, when we visited the New England ISO with the Tuck School of Business organized a trip this winter, I remember speaking to one of the ISO operators, like one of the high up dudes who was really in charge of, which assets were going to be turning on and off at any given time. I remember him saying something along the lines of, we have the solutions, we have the technology now that we need to solve this problem. If you all want to build a ton of nuclear power plants, that's fine. We can do that. We already have the solution. You just don't want it. So I think there are a lot of people who feel that, why don't we do this? There are a lot of people who feel, how could you possibly do this? I think there are a lot of people who have really strong opinions on one side or the other. I know Professor Eric Osterberg in the Earth Sciences Department, who is both very involved with climate change research and also with some, Upper Valley climate resiliency and adaptation working groups, feels that the last time I spoke with him, felt that nuclear could be a great part of the solution to the challenge of dramatically reducing our carbon emissions rapidly to avoid the worst effects of climate change.
Sure. John Jeffers points out that nuclear is great baseload energy. That is, it's very difficult to turn it on and off. So you have to run it all the time. The expense and challenge of nuclear, at least traditionally designed nuclear, is powering it up and powering it off. So it sort of runs continuously. It provides great baseload. But a really big challenge, which Tom just pointed out, is that it's currently very difficult to build because it's extremely expensive and the construction time is very long due to permitting challenges. So the way that I tend to think about nuclear, again, neither offering an opinion whether nuclear itself is good or bad, but it's just in practical terms, how are we going to solve some of these problems? And if something has a really long lead time and is very expensive, it makes it harder to use it to solve the problem. Now, different policies could change that. But in current conditions, nuclear is not a solution because of those difficult challenges. Again, as someone pointed out in the chat, Europe, there's plenty of countries in Europe, including France, that use an enormous amount of nuclear. Moving on, so this is a chart that shows US electricity retail sales to major end users. So this is sort of how it breaks down in terms of percentage of sales. And you'll see that's similar to the graph that I showed before in terms of residential, commercial, and industrial being the main sectors that are using electricity in dollars as well as units. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the cost of electricity. This was something that I worked on a lot when I worked in New York, when I was actually selling energy. And I found it fascinating to understand the breakdown of an electricity bill. Most people don't think about their electricity bill very much. And to be honest, that's because for most people in the United States, their electricity bill is not a big enough expense for them to really dive into what makes up that bill. And I don't mean there are plenty of people for whom paying their electricity bill is an onerous and something that has a real impact on their family and their well-being. But if you think about that as compared to mortgage costs or rent, for example, it's not typically your biggest expense. So your electricity cost that you pay as a consumer actually breaks down into some parts. The bottom of this pyramid is the cost of the electricity itself. So somewhere there's somebody dumping coal they paid for or natural gas they paid for into a plant or nuclear fuel and are paying people to be there, et cetera. And that has a cost. And that's the base of the pyramid. However, there are these three really interesting little pieces of your electricity cost that go on top. One is the capacity cost. So the capacity cost of your electricity is essentially, if you think about it, most of the time we are not using our peak electricity, or we are not demanding peak electricity. But for the peak hour of the peak day of the year, we are going to need a lot of electricity. And we expect the grid to continue to function at that time, right? So we could have a different system. We could have a grid that says, this is how much electricity we're going to produce. It's most of the base, it's all of the base load, and it covers most of us most of the time, right? But we're not going to deal with that peak hour, the peak day of the year. In fact, we're going to tell like Ginny and Joan and Bill that they just can't have electricity at that time because it's too expensive, right? We didn't do that. Instead, we said Ginny and Bill and Joan should all get electricity at that time. So we all have to bear the cost of having plants that are available for that peak hour of the peak day of the year, the so-called peaker plants that Kate was referring to. So in order to do that, we all have to pay for that cost of having those plants ready to run and operate at any given time so that we can handle that peak hour of the peak day of the year. And that's our capacity cost, right? That's the need to have capacity to handle that last little bit of electricity generation at the peak hour of the peak day of the year. In addition, you need to pay for ancillary services, things like the ISO, right? Things like having the transmission system, having assessment about how the transmission system should be upgraded over time. All these incidental costs to running the system. And then the last thing is the transmission cost, not the delivery cost, but the transmission cost over transmission lines. So that's what actually makes up your power bill. However, it's very difficult for you to see those costs because they're not broken down. So most people don't know what their per kilowatt hour electricity rate is. Their per kilowatt hour electricity rate that they see on their bill is an average over a month. And that average may fluctuate 1,000%. Sorry, the actual electricity rate may fluctuate 1,000% within a 24-hour period, actually. For example, on the peak hour of the peak day of the year, you might pay, $3 for that peak unit of electricity, and you might pay 3 cents for the off-peak unit of electricity that you're buying in the middle of the night. So hopefully that explains your electricity costs, or how electricity costs break down a little bit. Let me just take a look at the chat here and see where people are. It looks like there's a little contention around nuclear, or some discussion around nuclear. Let's see here. It looks like Howard pointed out that nuclear could be designed to power up and power down quickly, as in aircraft carriers and submarines, but that's just not how they were designed. And that price incentives don't make it worthwhile to ramp up and ramp down. Also, nuclear plants are typically out in dispatch as must run, or put in dispatch as must run. Got it. So yes. And so we typically leave them on, right? Joan asked, what is it physically required to upgrade transmission lines? More, longer, thicker devices and connections? I mean, my basic answer to that, Joan, is all of the above. We need more transmission lines. We need improved transmission lines. We need better transformers, connections. We need more secure electricity systems that don't blow down in a dry forest in the wind, right? Which is the problem California is experiencing, or transmission or transformers that blow up in the woods and set everything on fire. So that it's sort of everything in most grids. Not everywhere in all grids, but most things in most grids. Jeffrey asked, you mentioned that we do not have the storage capacity to deal with wasted energy. Vanadium redox flow battery technology is promising in that it can store more energy for longer periods with less loss and longer operating life than current technology. Not only that, but there's more vanadium in the world than there is lithium. I don't know that much about vanadium flow batteries. I do know a little bit about them, and a little bit about flow batteries in general. And it sounds like they do offer promising technology. I think batteries and electricity storage is a very interesting space. This is something that's going to explode over the next, again, you heard it here first, make your investments now, over the next 20 or 30 or 40 years. Because, not only battery technology, but also other ways of generating energy and storing energy are going to rapidly evolve. Hydrogen fuel cells come to mind as something that's going to change pretty dramatically over the next 20 years as a way to generate power with lower carbon. So I think that this world is going to change pretty quickly as we start to both create policy structures that incentivize that change and as the economics incentivize the change. As more and more global citizens want power. And if you think about, the 2 billion people that don't have access to power right now, electricity right now, that represents a really significant market opportunity. Bill Brown points out demand reduction is a huge part of preventing grid overload. That's a really good and important point. And so what is demand reduction for those of you that are not familiar with that term? Demand reduction literally means decreasing the amount of electricity that is consumed, decreasing the demand, particularly at the peak hour of the peak day of the year. So a way to avoid needing those capacity generators, those peak generators, is by shaving off the top of the peak. And that's much more efficient in many cases than building and running those plants. So demand response is one effective tool that's been used to produce this effect. So instead of, for example, saying, okay, we need to have enough capacity to handle that peak hour of the peak day of the year, I'm going to go out and say, hey, John Jeffers, you seem like a good guy. How about you go ahead and build a power plant and dump power in, just run it at those peak hours and you'll be a peaking plant. That's very expensive and all of us have to pay for it. Instead, I could say, hey, Kate, you run a giant paper mill and you use an enormous amount of power. How about I pay you to shut off at the peak hour of the peak day of the year? And if I get enough people to do what Kate's doing, enough paper plants or manufacturers or residential customers even, I can actually shave off the peak. And the customer can receive the benefit of that, either in avoided capacity costs or in payments. So that's a demand response payment, and it's a market tool that's been very effective in reducing the amount of demand at the peak hour of the peak day of the year. Dartmouth participates in a demand response program, as do many businesses. Sorry.
Some of you may have seen, like if you've been watching TV on a particularly hot day, like sometimes we'll get so close to our total capacity that the ISO will call up the state governor and say, hey, we've got a real problem here. And the governor will get on TV, have a press conference and ask residential customers to reduce their energy consumption by, turning off lights or not running the dishwasher or not doing their laundry, in the middle of the afternoon or whatever. And if you're a Dartmouth student on this call, if you've been on for a summer term, you may have gotten a email on a really hot day saying, reduce your energy usage as much as possible. And that's related to like a different part of Dartmouth's large scale electricity purchasing financing, but it's the same idea of Dartmouth trying to reduce its energy use during the peak hour of the peak day of electricity consumption on an annual basis.
Kate, I just wanted to pause here because I'm aware of the time, and I feel like we've just kind of like gotten into the good guts of this thing. So I want to maybe pause here and see what direction you want to go in our remaining time together.
Yeah. Do you have more electricity stuff or do you only have pipeline stuff?
Yeah, I think I do have more electricity stuff.
Why don't we try blasting through the rest of the electricity stuff and not take any questions unless somebody asks one that's particularly juicy.
Okay, cool. And by the way, people are putting really good solutions in the chat, which is great. So, I think this is an interesting time in electricity markets. Things are changing really fast. Typically, the electricity industry has not been thought of as a super hot, agile industry, but I think that the next 20 or 30 years, it very much will be. I guess maybe that is my last electricity slide, and then I go on to natural gas pipelines. I think I do. So maybe I'll just stop there. and we can pivot to some of the questions in the remaining time. I guess my point here was there are really interesting innovations. Again, some people have mentioned some of these in the chat, but that are happening in the energy space. For example, what would it mean if we went from a centralized grid with these large, monolithic, 40, 50, 60 megawatt plants producing energy to a distributed generation system where every home is producing energy and communicating with the grid? What does it mean to have a grid in an environment where a washing machine could communicate with the ISO or with the grid and could be either turned on or off to reduce demand or to make the system more efficient, or the homeowner could be charged a different rate really efficiently to motivate them to turn things on or off. For example, if I knew that if I ran my washing machine on the hottest hour of the hottest day of the year, it was going to cost me $50 to do a load of laundry, and if I did it that night, it would cost me $2, I probably would think really carefully about running my laundry in the middle of the day. And technology is at a place where your washing machine could communicate effectively with the grid, and we could use that information to really change how we consume energy in meaningful ways. Electric cars, which Bill Brown mentioned in the chat, also have a really big potential role to play in both energy storage and in imagining what a new grid should be, or a transformed grid. Because if everybody's plugging in cars every day, that's a really different reality in terms of both pulling energy out of the grid and also the potential to dump energy into the grid. Bill could charge at night and then he could drive his car to work, and he could be asked to plug in the middle of the day and shave off that capacity peak by pulling power from Bill's battery and the batteries of millions of drivers like him. So these are some of the things that I think are really interesting and will be really interesting over the next 20 years. I think this is a really fascinating space, and I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Rosie. And thank you everyone for joining. And I'm really excited by how many questions we had in the chat and how good the questions were tonight. As I said at the beginning of this talk, we have just one more session left to go before the end of Energy 101, and that is next week, and it's about navigating energy transitions. So we're going to look at Dartmouth's own green energy project and sort of longer term energy transition planning process as a case study in how individuals and organizations are thinking about transforming their energy systems within current economic and technological and resource availability constraints. And then we're going to sort of close with some more general thoughts about, global energy transitions and where we go from here. So before we leave, Rosie, I'll give you, did you have any final thoughts to share before I do a quick plug for upcoming events?
I just wanted to say, this is an interesting topic. I feel like we just barely got into it, and I'm happy to circle back around with Irving, and if there's demand for another conversation on the electricity system or electricity in general, or other topics, including Dartmouth's energy transition, I'm happy to do that.
Thank you so much, Rosie. So a few other events that you all might want to check out if you are plugged into other energy activities that we have going on at the Institute. We have a talk this Wednesday and a talk next Tuesday. One about energy poverty and health in a changing climate, and one about short-circuiting policy, interest groups in the battle over clean energy and climate policy in the American states. If you're a student on this call, there's an information session about the government and energy off-campus program. And if you're a student, including grad students, there are proposals due if you want to apply for a Irving Institute mini grant, and that's on Monday, November 2nd. So if you have questions about any of these, feel free to check out our website or shoot an email to the Irving Institute Dartmouth email account. Otherwise, thank you all so much for joining us tonight, and we hope you all have a great evening, and we hope to see you next week for the last edition of Energy 101. Thanks so much, everyone. Goodbye.